All right. So we are in the book of Esther. We finished Ezra last week, and we'll just kind of catch you up where we're at. Is we did Daniel, and at the end of Daniel, God gave Daniel the vision that that you've been in captivity for 70 years, and you're going to go back to the land. And so after 70 years, King Cyrus wrote a decree that they were to go back and they were to rebuild the temple. And that's what we saw in Ezra. God's great design. He said, you paid your dues in Babylon. Now it's time to go home. And 50,000 of them did. Now, that's only a small portion. And if we were to preach the book of Esther where it belongs, I would have stopped halfway through the book of Ezra. Because Ezra is about 60 years long in the book of Ezra. He talks about Zerubbabel going back 16 years to build the temple. They got discouraged. They had to have some Haggai and Zechariah had to come in and stir their hearts again. They got it finished. And then Ezra came back. But in the intervening years, we have the book of Esther. Now, Esther is an interesting book in that it never mentions the name of God in the entire book. And there's a reason for that. Because everybody that starts out in the book of Esther, they're out of the will of God. They're not where they're supposed to be. And we're going to see how God works behind the scenes. Do you realize that when you're out of the will of God, that God is still working behind the scenes because He has a perfect thing that He wants to have happen? In this case, it has to do with Israel. And the book of Esther, if you go to the Jewish culture, anybody ever heard of the Feast of Purim? The Feast of Purim. We got a few people. That's the book of Esther. It is all about what happened in the book of Esther. And one of the reasons that we believe that the scholars put the book of Esther into the Old Testament is to help us remember how God saved the entire Israelite people, even though some of the folks were out of the will of God. And so we're going to look at this, and we're going to look at the providence of God. The providence of God. Now, providence is the means by which God directs all things, both animate and inanimate, seen and unseen, good and evil, towards a worthy purpose, which means His will must finally prevail. And we actually saw it already where Cyrus, a pagan king, wrote a letter to send them back to go build the temple. We're going to see it again when he sends in the book of Nehemiah, when he uses another king to send them back to rebuild the walls. All of these are God's providence working behind the scenes to make things happen. Romans 8:28 is probably a really good New Testament gauge of this. And we know that God causes all things to what? Work together for good to those who love God and those who are called according to His purpose. Now, He doesn't say all things are good. There are many things that God uses in our lives that are not good. But the ending result will be good because it's God's will. And we can be entirely outside of God's will And God will say, you're not getting out of this. I have a job for you to do. I'm going to use you even though you've chosen a path I told you not to take. And so when you can be outside of God's will, and God, through his providence, will make things happen. So let's turn to the book of Esther. Turn to the book of Esther. And we're going to start out, we're going to meet the first two people in this book that are pagans. Out and out, not worshiping God as we know him, Jehovah, Yahweh. But they are two central keys to the book of Esther. So Esther chapter 1, verses 1 through 9. Now it took place in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces. In those days, King Ahasuerus sat on the royal throne, which was at the citadel in Susa. In the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all the princes in attendance, the army officers of Persia and Media, the nobles and the princes of his provinces being in his presence. And he displayed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor of his great majesty for many days, 180 days. And when these things were completed, the king gave a banquet lasting 7 days for all the people who were present at the citadel in Susa, from the greatest to the least in the court of the garden of the king's palace. And there were hangings of white and violet linen held by cords of fine purple linen on rings, silver rings and marble columns, and couches of gold and silver on mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones. Drinks were served in golden vessels of various kinds, and the royal wine was plentiful according to the king's bounty. And the drinking was done according to the law. There was no compulsion, for so the king had given orders to each individual of his household, so that he should do according to the desires of each person. And Queen Vashti also gave a banquet for the women in the palace which belonged to King Ahasuerus. Wow, this is quite a start to our story. King Ahasuerus, we've never heard that name before because it's not a name, it's a title. It's a title for a Persian king, and this particular king was Xerxes. Xerxes was the son of Darius. We saw Darius in both the book of Daniel and in the book of Ezra. And Darius was a Persian king, and he was the one who gave orders, and he searched out and said, hey, you guys can go back and build that temple. Go ahead, and we're going to give you our blessings. And Xerxes is his son. Xerxes has taken over this vast kingdom. Did you see how big it was? 127 provinces. One of those would have been Judah, Jerusalem. I mean, he reigned from as far north as Asia Minor, up around Antioch, if we were being in the New Testament, up where Paul went and preached, Ephesus, places like that, all the way down into Africa, all the way to the west, to northern Africa, and all the way to the east to India. That was all his and that wasn't enough. You see, Xerxes was somebody who wanted a little more, right? If you showed up in your Cadillac, he's going to show up in a Bentley or Rolls Royce. You see, he had to have the biggest and the best and a little bit more and the newest. And it wasn't good enough for him to have 127 provinces. He was a warrior. And during this time, Xerxes decides he's going to take on Greece. And so he marches a land army up north from Persia all the way north to Greece. And he sends another bunch by ship, a whole flotilla, armada that leaves and takes ships up to attack Greece. And if you're into history, read the Battle of Thermopylae. I see some heads shaking. You guys studied this in high school or college, right? And Thermopylae was this very narrow valley, and only a few people could come through at a time. And you had this great horde of Persian warriors on one side and a handful of Greek soldiers on the other side, and Greeks won. Because they couldn't bring their whole army through, and the Greeks just kept taking them off, one at a time. I mean, their arm would get tired. Hey, somebody else come up here and let's take out some more Persians. And Xerxes loses, and he has to go back. And that's what's happening during all of this time. And so Xerxes is showing off. He's like, I want everybody to see how rich I am, and look at all that I own. Kind of sounds like Solomon at one point, got him in a little bit of trouble, right? Look at all of this. And for 6 months, it's okay, Judah, you guys come down, and India, you guys come on over here, and the Amalekites, you guys come on, and oh yeah, bring everybody. For 6 months, he brings them through, throws little state dinners over and over again, and finally, after 6 months, he has the big party. For 7 days, he invites everybody from the capital city to come in. And we learn something interesting about the Persians. They segregated men and women. The king, he has a big party for all the men, and Vashti, the queen, has a party for the women. And we're like going, wow, that's kind of weird. Well, actually, King Cyrus, he was the one who actually made the rule that women would be veiled, have their faces veiled in public. Now, most of the time when we think of women who wear hair coverings and a veil and a burqa, we think of what? Muslims. 1,200 years before Islam was even founded, that's the way the Persians dressed. So you kind of, it makes sense when you think now, today, we go back and we look and see what's happening in Iran, which is modern-day Persia. They've been fighting this battle for millennia. Not just centuries, for millennia, for women to have a right. And that sets a stage for what's happening. Because what happens when a bunch of men get together? They gossip. Really? Yeah. Now they brag, right? I hit the ball 365 yards off the tee, right? I drive a Ford four-wheel drive, double cab, long bed, lifted with a 360. Now, what's the biggest engine they make? Anyway, that's the way we talk, right? They're bragging. They're bragging. I got that's what the boys do, especially when they start and notice the king's wine was flowing freely. Let everybody drink the way they want to drink, right? And so they're drinking and they're bragging. And somebody says, well, my wife's the best looking woman in all of Persia. And Xerxes stands up. No, she ain't. Queen Vashti is the most beautiful woman in all of Persia. Matter of fact, go fetch her in. Go have her come. I want to show her off in front of all of these men. Now, Queen Vashti is a woman of integrity. She is not about to go stand in front of a bunch of drunken men to show off her beauty. So she tells the king no. And it cost her everything. It cost her her position. Luckily, it didn't cost her her life, because it could have. The king could have said, you're disobeying the king's command, off with your head. But no, instead he says, you're banished. And it says after some time, he kind of got a little heartsick for Vashti, but he knew he couldn't bring her back, because the law of the Persians is that once a king makes an edict, you can't take it back. She's banished, and so he goes to all of his counselors, who are all men, and he says, what are we going to do? And they start talking and says, well, we can't let this stand, because this women's lib movement is going to cause us a problem. You see, if they find out that Queen Vashti was able to backtalk and not come when she was called, all of the wives in all of the provinces are going to hear about this, and then they're going to be burning their bras. And they're going to be taking their veils off. Oh, we kind of lived through that, didn't we? But that's what was happening here. And so, of course, a bunch of these guys, the guy counselors are saying, what are we going to do? Well, we're going to have a Miss Persia contest. We want the most beautiful women to come to pick a new queen. Now this is not like ours, where you have one night, you have the bathing suit and the talent contest and the interview process. This is a year process. And it also involves sleeping with the king. Yeah, that's their great solve. We're going to pick a new queen by this process. Now, they're going to do this, and the king's like going, yeah, sounds like a good idea. Let's do this. And that's what brings us then to chapter 2. As we come to chapter 2, the king has put out this call for all of these beautiful women to come and to interview to be queen. So we come to chapter 2, and I'll start at verse 5. Chapter 2, verse 5. And we'll meet our next two characters. Now there was in the citadel of Susa a Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite, who, having been taken into exile from Jerusalem with the captives who had been exiled with Jehoiakim, the king, Jeconiah, the king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had exiled. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had no father or mother. Now the young lady was beautiful of form and face. And when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So it came about when the command and the decree of the king were heard, and many young ladies were gathered to the citadel in Susa into the custody of Hegai, that Esther was taken to the king's palace into the custody of Hegai, who was in charge of the women. Now the young lady pleased him and found favor with him, so he quickly provided with her cosmetics and food, and gave her 7 choice maidens from the king's palace, and transferred her and her maids to the best place in the harem. So we have two people that we're introduced to. Mordecai, the Jew, as he's called, Mordecai the Jew, and his niece Esther, who he's raising. I want you to understand something. Mordecai and Esther were not in the will of God. They were not in the will of God. Mordecai was there when the king said, "You can go back. I'm financing your trip to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple." Only 50,000 after probably 1 million people, only 50,000 chose to go back. Mordecai was not one of those. Matter of fact, Mordecai apparently is a politician. He is stationed at the king's gate. And his job was when people came, he would say, "What do you have need of?" Now he spoke Hebrew. He probably also spoke Aramaic. He may have spoken a couple other languages, but people would come and he'd say, "So what do you need?" And they'd say, "I need a new chariot license." "Well, we're going to send you over here to DMV. Right? Or "I need a marriage license." "Oh, we're going to send you over here to the Hall of Records." I need to look up something in the archive." "Okay, we're going to take you over." He was a politician. He wasn't a big shot politician. He was just one of those guys that made his living by directing people where they needed to go. But where was he supposed to be? He was supposed to be back in Jerusalem. He was supposed to be back where he lived, because God had said in Jeremiah, when 70 years are up, I'm going to send you back. And he even got a pagan king to pay the bill. You can go first class. I'm going to pay your way. And Mordecai goes, "But God, I'm really comfortable." You know, that's one of the ways to get out of the will of God, is to get too comfortable. I'm really comfortable. I got a good job. All I do is stand around and I help people all day long, and people like that. Matter of fact, sometimes they slip an extra 20 in my pocket for helping them out. And I had a nice house here. And besides, I'm raising my niece, and you know, she's going through the teenage years, and I really don't want to uproot her and take her all the way back. And besides, Jerusalem's a mess. It's torn down. The temple hasn't been rebuilt yet. I really don't want to. It would be really uncomfortable for me. Besides, that's a long journey. It's 3.5 months to get back. He was out of God's will. And then you have Esther. Now, she would have known what God said in Deuteronomy. We talked about it last week. Don't marry the foreigners. Don't marry those. And how worse can it get than marrying the king of the Persians who are holding you captive? That's pretty bad. But she decides, I'm good looking. I can win this thing. But what's the consequences of winning? Well, we need to understand what the contest is. It's not Miss America, where you get the sash, or Miss USA, or whatever they do, whatever they call it these days. You get the sash and you get to represent for 1 year, and then you go back to your regular life and you got a big scholarship to go to school, right? No. If she wins, she becomes queen. If she loses, she goes into the harem of the concubines. Either way, she will never return to her homeland. She will never go back to Israel. She says, That's all right. I barely remember Israel anyway, and besides everything I hear, it's a mess. I really like where I live. Uncle Mordecai takes good care of me. I can shop at all the nice Persian shops, wear all the nice Persian clothes. I don't want to go back. As a matter of fact, this would be pretty cool. I could live in the palace. I could have all the finest things. And so she says, yeah, I'll do it. And Mordecai actually tells her, don't tell him you're Hebrew. Don't tell him you're Jewish. And she's up against all of these. Can you imagine all the beautiful women that are coming from Ethiopia, from India, all these exotic women that are coming from all over, and they're vying for this. And she comes in, and right off the bat, she wins the favor of the head eunuch. And so for 6 months, she's in spa treatment of one, and then for another 6 months, she's on the Atkins diet, or some sort of diet. They're providing all the food, all the cosmetics, just the good smelly stuff. She goes before the king, and guess what happens? She wins. It's over. He picks her as queen, and she's installed Queen Esther. And man, she's like, look at me. I won. But where is she? Totally outside of the will of God. Married to a pagan king that worships every god in the book. And that's where she is. But God in his sovereignty, but God, that's right, but God says, you know what? Even though you two are outside of the will of God, I'm going to put you in the right place while you're there. One day Mordecai is in his normal place outside of the king's palace. He's leaning up against a column. And on the other side of the column is two guys that are bodyguards to the king, and they're over here conspiring to kill the king. And Mordecai's like going, well, that's not very good. And so he uses his conduit, right? He goes to Esther. Esther, you need to warn the king. These two yahoos are going to kill the king. And they do an investigation. Sure enough, they find enough evidence. They convict him. They hang him. But Mordecai doesn't ever get any praise. Wouldn't you think the king would say, hey, Mordecai, come on up here. We're going to throw you a party. We're going to put the presidential medal around your neck. No, Mordecai is forgotten. Esther and Mordecai, God puts them in the right place, even though they're outside of the will of God. So we need to, there's another character here that we need to be aware of. His name is Haman. And we find Haman in chapter 3. So turn on to chapter 3. We're going to read the first 6 verses. After these events, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him and established his authority over the kings who were with him. And all the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, so that the king had commanded according to him. But Mordecai neither bowed down nor paid homage. When the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, why are you transgressing against the king's command? Now it was when they had spoken daily to him, and he would not listen to them, that they told Haman to see whether Mordecai's reason would stand, for he had told them that he was a Jew. And when Haman saw that Mordecai neither bowed down nor paid homage to him, Haman was filled with rage. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had told him who the people of Mordecai were. Therefore Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, who were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. So we need to know who Haman is. Now it says Haman the Agagite. Agagite is a title. Once again, not a name. Haman was an Amalekite. And we'll talk, Amalekites hated the Jews. Now, how do we know he was an Amalekite? Because he is an Agagite. In 1 Samuel 15:8, it says about Saul, Saul captured Agag, the king of the Amalekites, alive, and utterly destroyed all the people with the edge of the sword. The Amalekites had been a thorn in the side of Israel since they came out of Egypt. If you go back to Exodus chapter 17, you will find as the Egyptians came out of Egypt, they were on their way to the promised land, and all of a sudden the Amalekites attacked them out of nowhere. They weren't ready to fight yet. They had not established an army. And in Exodus chapter 17, we see this great picture of Moses when he holds, you remember this one? Moses holds the staff up, and as long as he's holding the staff up, they're winning. And when his hands get tired, and so who comes along? Joshua and Hur, right? And they pull up a stone. Here, have a rock to sit on. And they hold up his hands, and they win. They beat the Amalekites. And in Exodus chapter 17, God says, I'm going to wipe the Amalekites from the face of the earth. And he gives that job to Saul. And that's what we see in 1 Samuel 15. Is when he goes to fight the Amalekites, Samuel said, Saul, you leave nothing, scorched earth, not one thing living. And all of a sudden, Saul decides, I know better than Samuel. I am Saul the king. And he keeps Agag alive, the king alive, along with a whole bunch of sheep and all the best cattle. And he brings all this stuff back. And Samuel says, what are you doing? I'm just doing what you said to do. And he says, well, what are those sheep that I hear? What is those cows lowing? He said, you didn't follow my command. And here we have the Amalekites showing up years later, over 500 years later, we find them showing up and causing a problem through Haman. And he wants to do what? It says he hates the Jewish people, and I want to wipe them out. These Amalekites are terrible people. They hate the Jews. Now, if you really want to do, and I'm not going to go through all of this today because it'd take us another hour, but if you want to do some study in Jewish history, and you want to follow the Amalekites into modern day, you know where they end up? In modern day, they end up in Germany. Germany. Ooh, kind of reminds you of a little guy by the name of Hitler that wanted to wipe out the Jews. Isn't that interesting how through millennia, disobedience to God's command has repercussions over and over and over again? Matter of fact, the cost of being out of God's will is high. You see, we might think, oh man, God, I don't want to go. I don't want to do what you're telling me to do. I'm comfortable where I'm at. Oh, if I go and do this, it will cost me. I won't make as much money. Oh, God, I really love this person and I'm okay. You know, what's that country and western song? Looking for love in all the wrong places, right? If loving you is wrong, I don't want to be right. Don't get your theology from country and western music. That's the story. He says, I want you to be in my will. But if you're not, I'll still work it out. I will still work it out, but I'll do it behind the scenes. I may even still use you even when you're not in the will of God. But the cost is high. Esther never saw her home, Israel. She never left Susa. That was the price she had to pay for being out of God's will. Did God use her? Yes, he did. Matter of fact, we're going to look at chapter 4. I'm going to read all of chapter 4. And we're going to see Haman goes to the king and he says, hey, I would like to put out a hit on a people that don't worship you, all because he hates Haman. I want you to think about this for a second before I read this. Mordecai. Sorry. I want you to think about this for just a second. What would have happened if Mordecai would have gone back to Israel when he was supposed to? He would not have been standing in the king's court when Haman walked by. Therefore, Haman would have never seen him and got mad at the Jews and would have never put out an edict to kill all the Jews. Wouldn't that have been cool? All it would have taken was for Mordecai to obey God to go back. Problem solved. We don't need to rescue the Jews because there's never an edict. The cost of being out of God's will. Well, let's see how they remedy this. The edict has gone out. They have a year for all of the written out in all the different languages. The guys went out to serve it in every language, 127 provinces. And on this certain day, we're going to kill all the Jews. And look what happens in chapter 4. Now, when Mordecai learned all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the midst of the city and wailed loudly and bitterly. And he went as far as the king's gate, for no one was to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. In each and every province, wherever the command and decree of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting and weeping and wailing, and many lay on sackcloth and ashes. And then Esther's maidens and her eunuchs came and told her, and the queen writhed with great anguish, and she sent garments to clothe Mordecai, that he might remove his sackcloth from him, but he did not accept them. Then Esther summoned Hathach from the king's eunuchs, whom the king had appointed to attend her, and ordered him to go to Mordecai to learn what it was and why it was. And so Hathach went out to Mordecai to the city square in front of the king's gate, and Mordecai told him what had happened. the exact amount of money that Haman had promised to pay the king's treasuries for the destructions of the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the text and the edict which had been issued in Susa for the destruction, that he might show Esther and inform her, and to order her to go to the king to implore his favor and to plead with him for her people. And Hathach came back and related Mordecai's words to Esther. And then Esther spoke to Hathach and ordered him to reply to Mordecai. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that for any man or woman who comes to the king, to the inner court, who is not summoned, he has but one law, that is, to be put to death, unless the king holds out to him the golden scepter so that he may live. And I have not been summoned to come to the king for these 30 days. And they related Esther's words to Mordecai. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not imagine that you in the king's palace can escape any more than all the Jews. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. You and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you've come to the kingdom for such a time as this? And then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, go assemble all the Jews who are found in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night and day. I and my maids will fast in the same way. And thus I will go into the king, which is not according to the law, and if I perish, I perish. And so Mordecai went away and did just as Esther commanded him. Before Mordecai or Esther could truly be used of God, God had to restore them. Now, he couldn't take them all the way back before all of their sin. She was still the queen. He couldn't take Mordecai back and say, oh, well, go apologize to Haman. That wouldn't have helped. The problem's already happened. The edict is out there. And he says, and of course, the words that we always hear preached is, who knows that you've come to the kingdom for such a time as this, right? That's the big storyline of Esther. No, it's not. It's the fact that God was still going to use Esther despite her sin. You see, we can beat ourselves up. I'm sure Esther was saying, man, you know, here I became the queen, but for what reason? I haven't even been called to the king's throne for a month. Remember all of those women that were part of the beauty contest? They were all his concubines. He had all the most beautiful women in the world that he wanted. And Queen Esther had been kind of set off to the side for a while. He said, I can't even get in to see the king. He hasn't summoned me. But then when Mordecai talks where he said, okay, she says, okay. The last resort is what? Prayer. You ever get there? See, God says what? The first resort should be pray. Pray, 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 pray. Pray about everything. Pray constantly. Ours is, oh, I'm gonna try to fix it myself. I'm gonna get myself so deep down in trouble that the last thing I can find to do is to pray. And God says, no. He says, you need to be the first thing. You see, nothing great happens without prayer. And so not only does she say to pray, she says to fast. We don't do that a lot here. in the North American church. That's not a big thing that we do. I think we need to do more of it. Because there's quite often when God calls us to fast and pray, if we want to have great consequences, we want to have great confidence in our prayers, sometimes God asks us to give up a little bit. You know, hey, you can give up McDonald's for one day, right? You can fast, and that's what they did. You see, they had to restore their relationship with God. So Mordecai and all the Jewish people in Susa and Esther in the palace with all of her maids, the queen and all of these other people begin to pray and they begin to fast. And for the rest of the story, you've got to come to the farm. We will pick up in chapter 5 next week. And we will blackmail. Yeah, see? That's one way to get you to come to church, right? But we will pick up the story next week in chapter 5. But you know, it's if I could challenge you with one thing, it would be this. You see, all of us somewhere along the line, we get out of the will of God and we think we've messed up so bad that God can't use us. Remember the prodigal son? took his daddy's inheritance and spent it on prostitutes and fast living and ends up in the pig pen eating slop. And he says he came to his senses. And he says, if I can just go back to the Father's house and be one of his servants, they eat better than what I'm eating in the slop. And when he gets back, what does the Father say? Welcome home. He actually runs out to meet him. He said, before he ever even gives him a bath, he says, get the royal robe and get the robe of the family and put his signet ring back on his hand to signify he's still a son. You see, there's nothing we can do. We can get out of the will of God and we can have terrible consequences from that, but God still loves us, and God says, all you've got to do is return to me and I will use you in great and mighty ways. And that's what we're going to see next week. Esther, now, folks, it didn't solve all of Esther's problems. She still had consequences from her sin. She will never go back to Jerusalem. She will never be able to leave the Persian capital. But she has the honor of saving an entire people. And to this day, at the Feast of Purim, Esther is lifted up as a type of Christ, a savior of all the people.